for us. This is a killer story, to say the least. It's one of the strangest and deepest stories that I've been privy to stumble over in this text, let's say. We'll start with Numbers 21:4. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake up against God and against Moses. Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. I assume that's the manna. So they're not very happy with heavenly bread again. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, that's a dragon, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now there's a couple of very interesting spin-offs of that story. I'll start with a clinical interpretation. And then there's a very interesting reference to this story in the Gospels. And I'll maybe let Jonathan start with that. So this story is extremely interesting from a narrative and a clinical perspective, because maybe this wouldn't be as powerful narratively, but it would have made sense, you know. So the Israelites are getting all uppity again and faithless, and they're worshiping Egypt, and they're squawking and bitching away, and they're sick of heavenly bread, which is pretty pathetic, and they're not coming across well here again. And so God sends in snakes. And I think the reason for that, from the psychological perspective, is that, you know, you're in the desert and you don't have food and water, but you're not that smart, and there's some stupid things you could do, and you will do, that will even make it worse. And so they squawk and complain and murmur. Now not only do they not have the bread they want or the water, but now they have snakes biting them, and that's life, that's for sure. And then not because they're good, but because there's too many snakes, they decide, well, you know, maybe we're not that sorry, but we better go apologize to God and Moses, because, like, look at all the snakes. And so they get Moses to intercede, begrudgingly, I would suspect, I mean on the part of the people. And what God does is so strange. It's so remarkably strange, because he could have just got rid of the serpents. He sent the damn things. And it's an echo for me of why there's a snake in the Garden of Eden, by the way. Like, why does God put the snake there? It's Garden of Eden. You need a snake? And the answer to that might be yes, or that it's inevitable. But instead of just getting rid of the snakes, he does this very strange thing. He tells Moses to make an image of a snake, a fiery snake, so a dragon, a fire-breathing serpent, and he tells the people that if they come and look at the fire-breathing serpent, the snake, the poisonous snake, if they look upon it, that they will now be protected from the poison of the snake. And I thought, when I figured what this meant psychologically, I thought, oh my God, that's exposure therapy. That's exactly what it is. So in the clinical realm, over the last 100 years, clinicians of all stripes have agreed upon a few things. And one of them is that helping people voluntarily confront that which is poisoning them is curative. And it's not curative because it makes them less afraid. It's curative, and this has been worked out in great technical detail. It's not that they habituate to the danger. That's not what happens. It's that they become braver by voluntarily gazing on that which poisons them. And then that bravery generalizes. And so the actual redemptive process forward is to gaze voluntarily upon the things that poison you while you're along the way. And that's so absolutely remarkable. One of the things you do as a therapist is you calibrate the size of the serpents. You know, you don't want to expose a 3-year-old to a 50-foot dragon, but you kind of find a serpent that's about the right size. But the upshot, the Freudians will have you walk through the pathology of your past and confront that, right? And the narrative therapists will do the same thing, the cognitive therapists and the behaviorists take something you're afraid of, like an elevator, and expose you to it gradually. And you don't get less afraid. And we know that because, to begin with, the behaviorists would have people relax, like they do breathing exercises, because the idea you were counter-conditioning them against fear. So you were afraid. You had to see the terrible thing and learn to relax. But then they learned real soon you didn't have to teach anybody to relax. It didn't make a damn bit of difference. You just had to put them on the edge. And so that voluntary confrontation with poisonous catastrophe strengthens you. And so now there's still serpents, but they can't poison you. And that's even a better deal because, well, there are serpents. And so maybe the mother can chase away all the serpents, right? But then the mother's the serpent. And so you want to fortify your people. You want to make them strong. And that's what's happening symbolically here. And that's so damn brilliant. It's amazing that it's encapsulated in this story. But then there's an even weirder twist. And I'll get Jonathan to start the comment on this, because Christ says of himself in the Gospels that he has to be lifted up like this brazen serpent in the desert. And that's a very strange thing for someone to say, because why would Christ assimilate himself to, of all things, a serpent on a post? And then why does he say that he has to be lifted up? And I think the answer to that is that part of what the gospel story does, the Passion of Christ, is it aggregates all the serpents. It's like the gospel, the Passion of Christ is at minimum, it's an account of all the terrible things that could possibly happen to you in your life if all the terrible things that could happen in a life happened to you. So it's like, it's all the serpents. The crucifixion is all the serpents at once. It's betrayal, and it's death, and it's torture, and it's unjust death, and it's being selected for death over a criminal, and it's betrayal of your best friend. It's like everything. And the idea there is that if that is confronted voluntarily and radically accepted, it's simultaneously transcended. And the fact that those narratives stack on top of one another, and they do that because of this reference that Christ makes back to the serpent, is just, I just can't believe that. It's absolutely beyond comprehension.
Can I just quickly ask, speaking as a clinician, what does that mean? Let's say you mentioned betrayal. Let's say someone is terrified or afraid of betrayal. What does it mean to
confront it?
To confront it. Practically, well, how do you do that?
Part of it is you do it practically. You get the details of the story, exactly what happened, exactly how did this occur. Look at every single detail. Then you help people think, were there weaknesses in your approach that made it more likely that this would occur? So, for example, maybe there's a history of you being betrayed. It's happened to you 4 times, and it's taken you out each time. It's like, well, once it's the other person, twice it's the other person, 3 times it's you. And so then often what you find in therapy is that people who are betrayed repeatedly are far too trusting and naive. They're too childlike, they're too dependent, they haven't looked on enough serpents in their life, they don't have the eyes of, they're all dove and no snake. And so they get betrayed all the time. And so you help them, and then you also help them contend with the fact of the potential that they could betray people. So there's that evil within them, like Harry Potter being, touched with the soul of Voldemort and being able to talk to snakes. They have to make contact with that possibility within them. And then generally they have to learn to be aggressive. Because people who are naive and then lay themselves open to psychopathic manipulation generally don't have any aggression incorporated within them. So they also have to confront the idea of the serpent within. And so that's part of the way you would step through that.
Can you finish your sentence? Having people gaze upon what frightens them. Please finish the sentence. It's
fortifies
awesome.
them.
Fortifies
them. And that's that. See, the behaviorists faced opposition from the psychoanalysts when they first implemented exposure therapy. The psychoanalysts said, look, they say they're afraid of an elevator, but really the elevator is only a symbol for something like death. And so if you teach them to not be afraid of the elevator, a death fear will just pop up somewhere else. You'll get symptom substitution. And so there's a big argument in the psychological community about this. But what happened is, that isn't what happened. But here's why. It's so cool. So I had a client who was afraid of an elevator. And so what we did, first of all, I had her look at pictures of elevators. And that was enough for her for a while. And then we'd go out in the hallway and she'd stand like 100 feet away and just look at an elevator. And the rule was, walk near the elevator till you're nervous, stop, and then just wait till you're not nervous. But look at the damn elevator. When you take someone inside an elevator, they'll look at their feet. You have to say, no, you got to look at the numbers, the display where you are. You have to look at the control panel. You have to investigate with your central vision every element of what you're avoiding, because otherwise you won't accustom yourself to it, you won't get braver. And so then you just put the person on the edge, and then maybe by 3 sessions, they're like right next to the elevator. So now I have my client right next to the elevator, and she hasn't done that for years. I said, look, you have to establish a relationship of trust before you can do this. I said, look, I'm gonna push the doors are gonna open, and then I'm gonna hold the door. And I won't play any tricks, I'm not gonna do anything to startle you, because that's a big mistake in those circumstances. I just want you to just look in, and that'll be enough for today. And so she looks in and she goes, that's a tomb. And I thought, yes, that's exactly right, because for her, see, the fantasy for someone who's afraid of an elevator, it's very, very standard fantasy. I'll get trapped in there, the lights will go out, I'll start to have heart palpitations that are indication of a heart attack, because lots of people who have elevator phobias have panic attacks, and they're afraid they're gonna have a heart attack. I won't be able to get to the hospital and find a figure of authority. I'll die here. And it'll be even worse if there are people who are in the elevator, because I'll make a bloody fool of myself and humiliate myself, and then I'll die. And so they get both fears, fear of social rejection and humiliation, and of death. But so when they do encounter the elevator and walk in past the threshold, they are walking into the tomb. They're playing out the symbolic realm and the practical realm simultaneously. And that does generalize. And so one of the things you see very frequently in therapy, if you teach people to be more assertive, particularly happens with women, is that, you know, they're dependent and afraid, and so they're over-dependent on their husband, and so then their husband can tyrannize them. And so then you walk the woman through exposure therapy, and she gets braver, and then she'll go home and have a fight with her husband. And husbands often resist the transformation, because as the woman becomes braver by looking at the serpents, she's more willing to take on the tyrant in her husband. And then you get familial resistance to the movement towards health on the part of the client, because, you know, maybe he's all accustomed to having this wife who, you know, never says boo. And that's not so good for him, because she's not very interesting, but, you know, at least he gets to do whatever he wants whenever he wants. It's a stupid trade, but lots of people will make it. But it's so cool that, well, that's in this story, that's the best way to deal with serpents, is not to get rid of them, but to look at them. Like,
and
God,
we made the point
so
earlier,
wise.
didn't we, another session, that this is why the whole safety culture in universities is so idiotic. I mean, trigger warnings and, I mean, that, you know, what can be, in a sense, more transforming in a deeply spiritual sense than confronting the inevitable suffering of the human condition.
This is why I'm appalled by my professional colleagues. It's like they all know, all of them know, that not only is the idea that you should protect your students from triggers wrong, it's not just wrong. It's the opposite of what you should do. It's not just a lie, it's an anti-truth. They all know that. They won't come out and talk about it.
There's
some of them.
There's two other little pieces I just wanted to comment on. One is that, again, it's like an inoculation, right? So that's another level.
You bet.
Right, because you
That's what a pharmacon is. It's a hair of the dog that bit you.
Yeah.
And the idea was a tiny bit of the poison will cure you. Yeah.
And the other thing that's really interesting in this is that, like you said, well, why doesn't he just get rid of all the snakes? And your analysis, when you're talking about like habituation doesn't work and that you grow less afraid, the fact is you grow stronger. And that's one of the things, is when confronting something, it's so interesting. It's always with you. Your sins are always with you. Your flaws are always with you. You grow up the other parts of yourself stronger in relation to them. Right? And so if you take away the snakes, it takes away the problem. But they're carrying away, you have to carry that fear all the way through. And so much of this is about trying to figure out how to contain. I mean, the Israelites they're like a dark, victim-y reflection of Pharaoh's stubbornness again and again and again. It's the other version of that. But they have to grow another part of themselves bigger. That part's always going to be there. There's the golden calf, and 2 minutes later, you're striking the rod twice, and 2 minutes later, right, the ground's opening up and swallowing people. It's the other parts that have to be strengthened.
Right. Well, it's so interesting, because there's I don't remember what the study of the justification of suffering is called. You know, to justify God despite the fact that the world is rife with suffering.
Theodicy.
Theodicy. Okay, so what's the theodicy? Is no adventure without danger. Okay, but danger brings up the theodicy problem, right? If it's real danger, if it's real peril, what about the suffering of children? And the answer to that is something like, be better. Not have the danger go away, not make everything into a peaceful paradise where, you know, the naive can dance and play without fear. That's not it. It's something like, you know, form yourself into the guise of a holy warrior in the most real sense, so that you can contend with dragons, not so that they cease to exist. And it's so interesting too, because you have this fundamental myth that's unbelievably old. Oldest story we have, I would say. It's told in every adventure story. Well, there's no dragons. Well, then there's no gold. Because it's always the dragon that hoards the gold. So does it mean too that if you get rid of the dragons, you make everything hyper safe? Is there's no gold? And that certainly seems to be the case. Is you take the spirit out of people by making things hyper safe, but you might also deprive them of the deepest treasure. And I do talk to my audiences about this around the world. It's like, do you want to be happy, satiated, comfortable, safe, secure? Like if you could have what you wanted, is that what you want? And if it is, how is that different from just being an infant who's asleep? Because you don't even need to be conscious if that's your life. Because you just seek into unconsciousness when you're satiated. That's what you do after a Thanksgiving meal. You want to be awake. Well, why? Because you have an adventure to undertake. Well, what's the adventure? Well, dragons everywhere, right? But the idea here would be if you can adopt the right attitude towards the dragon transforms itself into gold. That's actually the story of the resurrection, most fundamentally, right? Is that if you accept your catastrophic destiny thoroughly, what you get out of that isn't death and humiliation and the descent into hell. What you get is the eternal resurrection of the human spirit. And that's a walloping story, because it turns out to be, you see that in clinical practice over and over again, is that the person grows in proportion to their willingness to voluntarily confront the tragedy of their life. And then you might say, well, what if you did that completely? Like, I mean, I know it's a receding goal and an impossibility, but it still begs the question. If you took that all onto yourself as voluntarily as you could, the whole bloody mess as voluntarily as you could, do you simultaneously transmute it? And I mean, all the micro stories indicate that the answer to that is yes. So that's something, man.
This story, I mean, it's one of the stories that I've thought about the most in my life. I wrote an entire play around the meaning of the story and how it's one of the stories that brought me to become Orthodox. It's difficult to explain, but you know, until the beginning, since we started this, I'm trying to avoid always talking about Jesus. Like I do end up bringing him in. I'm sorry, but I try to avoid
smuggling.
Just Jesus smuggling, right? But this is a moment where I'm gonna do it, because I think that the story of the crucifixion is so difficult to understand. It is so, you look on that story and it is so confusing, and we have an intuition. Some people have an intuition that there's something right about it, and we can kind of see it, but it wrecks everything in terms of our narrative. And we have a hint of that in the story of the bronze serpent. In the Garden of Eden, God says, don't eat the fruit or you will die. And then the serpent says, if you eat the fruit, you will be like God. And in some ways, the secret is yes and yes. That's the secret. The secret is, what you see in the story of Jesus is someone who is willing to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and die. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference between him and Adam. Mm-hmm. And there are many images in the story of the crucifixion to show us that that's what he's doing. He's standing between a good thief and a bad thief. There are many images to show us that what he's doing is eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and is willing to die. And then that death becomes glory.
Well, you see that as a pattern too. There's this great medieval image that made an unbelievable impact on me when I saw it. And so it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life at the same time. And on the one side, there's Eve handing out skulls, apples, to people, and that's the distribution of death. And on the other side, there's Mary, who I think it's a representation of the true church in feminine form, and she's handing out wheaten hosts, and they're also fruits of the tree. And the idea there is that the incorporation of the pattern of Christ's voluntary sacrifice is the medication for the death that's produced as a consequence of the fall. Yeah. And that's, and then to speak of that psychologically only, which is what I'll try to do here, is to say that the idea there is that the medication for the nihilism-inducing, despair-inducing catastrophe of tragedy is not to protect yourself from it or to veil yourself from it, to shield yourself from it, but to voluntarily confront it and investigate it in every painful detail, all of the catastrophe. And that, paradoxically, alleviates the catastrophe.
But it's also redemptive, isn't it? I mean, I think Jonathan's absolutely right. It's kind of inevitable, particularly for Christians, to interpret that this kind of Christologically or kind of proleptically looking forward, because that description of Christ of being lifted up as the serpent is followed immediately by possibly the most famous verse in the whole of the New Testament, John 3:16. So John's own explication is following that lifting up phrase, one of three, I think, in the New Testament, is God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever should believe in him should not perish but have eternal life.
Right,
so it was a kind of antidote here in Numbers, an antidote to the poison, an antidote to the consequences of their wrongdoing. But it's transmuted into eternal life and salvation in the New Testament.
With regards to the idea, and correct me where I get this wrong, of the Christological voyage in the Orthodox Church, my understanding of that psychologically is that the degree to which you are capable of acting in a redemptive fashion in the world, so following in the footsteps of Christ, let's say archetypally, is precisely proportionate to the degree that you're willing to voluntarily confront and bear the suffering of life. Then you think, well, you got to think about that practically. It's like, well, how could that possibly be any different? How could it be any different than that? Because you do owe God a death, and you're going to be betrayed, and all of these catastrophes are implicit in your destiny. And then you kind of have, there's only two ways to go about that. One would be, well, I'm not paying any attention to that. That's for sure. But everyone knows perfectly well that how often do you solve a problem by not paying attention to it? Like everybody knows, pretending it's not there. Everybody knows that just makes problems multiply. So you have to confront a problem to solve it. And so then you might say, well, do you have to confront the problem of problems to solve it? And the answer to that could easily be yes. And then the question is, well, how radical could the solution be? And I would say, well, it seems clear to me from the people I've met who have acted in some redemptive capacity in the world that that's directly proportionate to their existential courage. Those things just seem like bound together inextricably. And so, well, I guess what that means in part is, well, the biblical stories have to be stories about us because, obviously, right, because they're stories about us. And then the question is, well, how deep does that go? And that brings us back to the idea, too, that we're all made in the image of God, you know, and that it's incumbent upon us to act that out in our life to the degree that we can. And then you might say, well, what's the ultimate consequence of acting that out ultimately? And the answer is, well, that's what you find out in your life. But who knows what the upper limit of that is? Certainly you know in the micro details that the people you admire spontaneously, the people even that you might be in awe of, are the people who have borne more than their share of the existential catastrophe of life. And they certainly gleam, their faces shine as a consequence of their capacity to do that. And sometimes unbearably, right? Because they're also simultaneously judges. That person has attained such stature that I'm embarrassed in his presence. I think those are just practical realities. So it's a hell of a lot of information encapsulated in one little story. So, all right, gentlemen, if we're very careful, we can time this perfectly. On to Deuteronomy.